Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. From the Meridian Room in the Park Plaza Hotel in New York City, we bring you the music of Raymond Raquello and his orchestra. With a touch of the Spanish, Raymond Raquello leads off with La Comparsita.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. At 20 minutes before 8 Central Time, Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory, Chicago, Illinois, reports observing several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars. The spectroscope indicates the gas to be hydrogen and moving toward the Earth with enormous velocity. Professor Pearson of the observatory at Princeton confirms Farrell's observation and describes the phenomenon as, quote, like a jet of blue flame shot from a gun, unquote. We now return you to the music of Raymond Raquello, playing for you in the Meridian Room of the Park Plaza Hotel, situated in downtown New York.
Americans gathered around their radios were fooled, frightened, even panicked by what they heard.
Orson Welles had shaken the country without knowing it was possible.
A mythical invasion by monsters from the planet Mars should have had so profound an effect upon radio listeners.
Good morning. My name is Carol Rosen. In 1974, after being a sixth grade school teacher, I was introduced to the late Dr. Werner von Braun, in the U.S., the father of rocketry.
Years ago, many years ago, back in 1972, I was sitting at my desk about 4:30 in the morning at the headquarters of the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet, arranging the information that had come in over the last 24 hours so that we could prepare a briefing for the Admiral and his staff, which would take place later that morning.
In my first meeting with him, during that first 3.5 hours, he said to me, Carol, you will stop the weaponization of space. And we have to prevent the weaponization of space because there is a lie being told to everyone that the weaponization of space is now first being based upon the evil empire, the Russians. Then there would be terrorists. Then there would be third world countries. Then there would be asteroids. And then he would repeat to me over and over, and the last card, the last card, the last card would be the extraterrestrial threat.
One of these projects was called Project Red Light. The purpose, according to this document, was to back engineer captured extraterrestrial technology for adaptation into the United States space program. Now, I've since come to believe that the extraterrestrial portion of all of this is nonsense, but that the technology is real. I believe that many of us were shown these documents over the years so that later we would talk about it. I mean, how can you keep the existence of extraterrestrials, if they were real, a secret? And how could anyone keep quiet knowing that they had seen documentation, official government documents, labeled top secret, that expressed that these extraterrestrials were real and had visited this Earth?
In other words, we have to have some reason to spend these trillions, to waste these dollars on a space-based weapon system, and they're all lies.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a grave announcement to make. Incredible as it may seem, both the observations of science and the evidence of our eyes lead to the inescapable assumption that those strange beings who landed in the Jersey farmlands tonight are the vanguard of an invading army from the planet Mars. The battle which took place tonight at Grover Mills has ended in one of the most startling defeats ever suffered by an army in modern times. 7,000 men armed with rifles and machine guns pitted against the single fighting machine of the invaders from Mars. 120 known survivors. The rest strewn over the battle area from Grover's Mill to Plainsboro, crushed and trampled to death under the metal feet of the monster, or burned to cinders by its heat ray.
The first thing I did was collect every bit of documentation that I could find, both from the Freedom of Information Act, from the research of others, from books that had been printed on the subject of UFOs, and of course through my network of friends in the intelligence community. What I discovered was amazing. What I discovered, ladies and gentlemen, is that there has been a plan in existence since about 1917, and probably before that, to create an artificial extraterrestrial threat to this Earth in order to create a one-world totalitarian socialist government.
To our calling State Hill, New York. Isn't there anyone on the air? Isn't there anyone on the air? Isn't there anyone? 2X, 2L.
This is Orson Welles, ladies and gentlemen.
Out of character to assure you that the War of the Worlds has no further significance than as the holiday offering it was intended to be. The Mercury Theater's own radio version of dressing up in a sheet and jumping out of a bush and saying boo. Starting now, we couldn't soap all your windows and steal all your garden gates by tomorrow night, so we did the next best thing. We annihilated the world before your very ears and utterly destroyed the Columbia Broadcasting System. Now, you will be relieved, I hope, to learn that we didn't mean it, and that both institutions are still open for business. So, goodbye, everybody, and remember, please, for the next day or so, the terrible lesson you learned tonight. That grinning, glowing, globular invader of your living room is an inhabitant of the pumpkin patch. And if your doorbell rings and nobody's there, that was no Martian. It's Halloween.
For as long as I can remember, I've maintained a deep interest in the idea of aliens and UFOs. It's a topic that fueled my imagination as a child and a fascination that I've carried into adulthood. And so I gotta say, it's been pretty interesting to watch how our government and media have suddenly pulled a complete 180 and are now approaching the topic with credibility and seriousness. I mean, it seems like it was just yesterday when the concept of space aliens was regarded as pure science fiction, and it was relegated to the realm of entertainment, and bringing it up in serious conversation was a good way to either get a laugh or to get laughed at. The media dismissed it as fantasy, the government would smirk and scoff and deflect whenever being pressed about the topic, and this dismissive attitude set a tone for the public, that anybody who dared question the official story was to be dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. But now something strange is happening. Almost overnight, the conversation has just shifted, and our government, it seems, is now urging us to accept the idea that we are not alone. Every week we're seeing talking heads on the news discussing UAPs, which is just the new term for UFOs, by the way. And we're seeing former government insiders claiming that our military is in possession of exotic alien materials, including spaceships even.
If you believe we have crashed craft, stated earlier, do we have the bodies of the pilots who piloted this craft?
As I've stated publicly already in my News Nation interview, biologics came with some of these recoveries, yeah.
Were they, I guess, human or non-human biologics?
Non-human, and that was the assessment of people with direct knowledge on the program I talked to that are currently still on the program.
But why now? I mean, has something changed behind the scenes that has provoked this spontaneous disclosure campaign? Are we being prepared for something? Are we about to witness the long-awaited alien invasion that Hollywood has been grooming us to anticipate now for generations?
There's a lot of interest in the people coming from space,
Yes.
And I know you're interested in that.
Oh, very interested in that. How much did they tell you about that?
A lot.
Really?
Yeah.
What'd they tell you?
But I'm here to ask some different questions. What if our government's newfound transparency about UFOs is not about disclosure, but about disinformation? What if it's not about revealing the truth, but about projecting a lie? What if aliens are not the true subject of this grand cover-up, but merely just the cover story? Maybe the real cover-up is actually about misdirection. Maybe it was never about downplaying the existence of aliens and UFOs, but rather about fueling our belief in them. Just classic reverse psychology, playing on our natural instinct to distrust authority, especially when that authority is already seen as secretive or manipulative. Because trust me, that's a reality that is not lost on the military-industrial complex. So by constantly denying the existence of aliens, and casting doubt on every sighting or encounter, they have only reinforced the idea that there is indeed something worth hiding. And for those of you who are familiar with Project Blue Book, you know what I'm talking about. And I'm not going to take much time to break Project Blue Book down because I think it's pretty well known at this point. But to summarize, Project Blue Book was a U.S. Air Force program conducted from 1952 to 1969 that was tasked with investigating reports of UFOs. And infamously, of the tens of thousands of cases that were reviewed, most were just dismissed as misidentifications of natural or man-made objects, though a small percentage do still remain unexplained. But even at that time, people didn't really tend to believe the Blue Book explanations of these sightings. They were often ridiculous, and it seemed that the government was coming up with any bogus excuse it could think of to identify these sightings. And they were just so obvious about it, It was as if they were practically begging us to question the official narrative. I mean, why invest so much effort and resources and secrecy into debunking a so-called non-existent threat? Why hide archives of documented reports on aliens and UFOs if there's nothing to them? It's almost like they were deliberately trying to make us suspicious. What if, for reasons unknown to us that we'll soon explore, the powers that be always intended for humanity to embrace a belief in aliens? But what if they had no evidence to back it up? Well, I guess the next best thing would be to pretend that you are concealing such evidence. And I know it might seem far-fetched, but let's not forget about all the grand deceptions and top-down conspiracies that have already woven their way into our children's curriculum. From the promotion of Darwinian evolution and the Big Bang Theory to modern textbooks that can't even offer a clear definition of what a woman is. From there, it's not much of a leap to imagine the existence of aliens being the next piece of officially sanctioned nonsense added to that list. Because when you think about it, belief in extraterrestrials is really just a logical extension to the theory of evolution. It's just the natural progression of that line of thinking. I mean, if you believe that life can grow naturally and evolve here on Earth, and if you also believe that Earth is simply one planet out of 100 trillion others, then the groundwork is already laid. And the concept becomes less like a theory and more like a logical, if not even an obvious conclusion. Of course, aliens would exist if the Big Bang were true and if evolution were true. But even beyond the spiritual stuff, there's also a significant political motive that's been pushing this agenda of an alien invasion narrative.
Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us? What could be more alien to the universal aspirations of our peoples than war and the threat of war?
Because just imagine what kind of power that deception could wield. It could justify the suspension of rights and the imposition of new laws, the consolidation of world power, and all in the name of protecting humanity from a common enemy. I can't imagine a more compelling justification than that to impose a new order on Earth.
If we discovered that space aliens were planning to attack, and we needed a massive buildup to counter the space alien threat, and really inflation and budget deficits took secondary place to that, this slump would be over in 18 months. And then if we discovered, whoops, we made a mistake, there aren't actually any space aliens.
So we need Orson Welles, is what you're saying.
No, there was a Twilight Zone episode like this in which scientists fake an alien threat in order to achieve world peace. Well, this time we don't need it. We need it in order to get some fiscal stimulus. I actually have a serious proposal, which is that we have to get a bunch of scientists to tell us that we're facing a threatened alien invasion. And in order to be prepared for that alien invasion, we have to do things like build high-speed rail and then once we've recovered, we can say, whoops, there were no aliens.
But we're not likely to have a credible alien threat anytime soon.
I probably shouldn't have said anything about this because I gave the game away. So yeah, I should probably have broached the thing quietly to some people at NASA.
And so if it's true that this phenomenon is simply part of a larger agenda, then we're left to wonder just how far they might go, to affirm the existence of aliens and also to control the narrative surrounding it. And to answer that question, you really don't need to look any further than the life of Paul Bennewitz in what must be one of the saddest stories to ever emerge from the world of ufology.
Paul Bennewitz, a self-made man, a very successful businessman, was systematically driven insane, wound up in an insane asylum, under treatment for a long time, lost his business, had to turn it over to his family, and was destroyed.
Paul Bennewitz was a highly respected electronics expert and a well-liked businessman who, by the late 1970s, had built a successful life in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He was clearly a really intelligent guy, and he was an impressive engineer, as well as a bit of a UFO enthusiast. So when he began to notice strange lights in the skies near Kirtland Air Force Base, which happened to be close to his home, he decided to dig deeper. He started capturing pictures and videos of these mysterious lights and UFOs, building a large archive of physical evidence to support his sightings. And he even began to monitor this stuff with his own sophisticated radio equipment, and he was intercepting radio transmissions and attempting to decipher what he thought to be coded messages within the radio signals. And what began as curiosity would quickly spiral into a full-scale personal investigation. And before long, Bennewitz became convinced that he had successfully tapped into real communications between extraterrestrial spacecrafts and a secret alien base hidden in the nearby mountains. So Bennewitz did what any patriotic American might do. He took his findings to the U.S. Air Force. After all, this was a matter of national security, and that was the day when Paul Bennewitz became the unwitting target of a military psyop that's so cruel and so unusual you wouldn't believe it if you didn't see it yourself.
I'm Richard Doty. There's probably about 80% of false information being presented, about 20% of factual information. Unfortunately, the UFO community doesn't know which is which.
And that's your job to keep it that way?
That was my job before. I'm a private citizen now, but back in the early 80s, it was my job to confuse the UFO community.
This is Richard Doty, an agent from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, and he's the man who met with Bennewitz to review his footage and recordings. But if you were in charge of security at a military base and then some citizen were to approach you with boxes that were filled with photos and video recordings and even radio transmissions that were detailing top secret military tests, then you would understandably have some reasonable concerns. But rather than simply dismissing Bennewitz's wild claims or reassuring him that no alien activity existed, like, somebody might have expected him to do, Doty did the exact opposite. He confirmed Paul's suspicions, telling him that his theory was correct, and that aliens truly do exist, and there really is an alien base hidden nearby, and that the Air Force has been trying to investigate the situation, and Bennewitz just happened to stumble right into the middle of it all.
And it was very easy to convince Paul. Paul was a World War II veteran. He's very patriotic. He always flew his flag. Those type of people you can convince that, listen, just telling Paul, you can't tell anybody else about this because this, they could get in the wrong hands. And so immediately Paul became a cooperating source, and he held everything that he had gotten in secrecy.
But Doty wouldn't stop there. He actively fed Bennewitz fabricated information, forged documents, false leads, and made up stories about underground alien bases and government interactions with these extraterrestrials. The goal, according to Doty, was supposedly to divert Paul's attention away from any real Air Force operations by keeping him fixated on this fake alien narrative, which he already seemed to believe in the first place.
The Air Force actually put him in a helicopter with Rick Doty the first time and flew him up to a place above Dulce called the Archuleta Mesa. And before they took him up there, they dumped a bunch of props up there. They flew him up there, flew him over the mesa and said, "You're right, Paul, look, there's stuff here, there's some evidence of what's going on. Why don't you check this out for us?"
And that might seem reasonable at a glance, but if you think about it, it makes no sense at all. I mean, you'd think that if the United States Air Force needed to prevent some random citizen from recording sensitive information, it shouldn't be that difficult of an issue to resolve, They could have politely accepted his evidence and just sent him on his way. They could have restricted his access to the area. They could have even warned him under the guise of national security. But instead, Doty and his associates would go out of their way to convince Bennewitz that he truly was encountering extraterrestrial activities. They even went so far as to manipulate Bennewitz's radio equipment, causing it to register fake signals, and reinforcing his belief that he had tapped into alien communications. And whenever Paul came across something big, he always had Doty just a phone call away, and regularly stopping by to check up on his findings. And so, in the mind of Paul Bennewitz, Richard Doty was becoming a genuine friend. You know, it must have seemed like an incredible sign of trust and respect for a government agent like Richard Doty to openly share classified information with an ordinary citizen like himself. So I'm sure that from Paul's perspective, this gesture made him feel pretty important and special, you know, as if he was really on the trail of something significant, or at least something real. But in truth, Doty was no friend to Paul Bennewitz. He was actively manipulating him and feeding him lies and propaganda under the guise of a privileged friendship. It really all just seems like a cruel joke. You know, the stories that Doty told were just complete fiction, the materials that he shared were only fabrications, and even the mysterious radio transmissions were fake. And what Paul Bennewitz saw as a genuine friendship was, to Doty, nothing more than just another day at work. From that point, things only escalated. More agents became involved, and what began as a simple tactic of diversion and misdirection turned into a full-blown campaign of psychological warfare against the citizen Paul Bennewitz. White lies and doctored photos were now replaced with elaborate hoaxes, and at one point they even started to stage fake UFO sightings, and they were using these secret military aircraft, I'm sure the same ones that Paul had been filming, and they were orchestrating flyovers of Paul Bennewitz's home using helicopters that were disguised as flying saucers.
Oh, he says, you know, my real job is I'm in a special group in New Mexico. We've been doing something that is really interesting. He said, it just blows my mind. He said, we got these helicopters that I'm flying. He says, these helicopters are all fixed up. First of all, they got no markings on them. Second of all, they're really fast. Third, they're really quiet. And they got a lot of lights. We got red lights, we got white lights, we got strobe lights. I said, what are you talking about? He says, we pretend we're UFOs.
And although Paul managed to hold himself together for a while, the psychological toll on his mind would reach its breaking point when this fabricated alien narrative spiraled into what Paul Bennewitz perceived to be an imminent and inevitable alien invasion on the horizon. And from that point forward, his health and sanity would begin to quickly deteriorate as he devoted himself almost entirely to uncovering this truth. This truth, which was actually just a manipulation being fed to him, in particular by Richard Doty, his friend from the government. A fake friendship that was based on lies and deception, and one that would eventually break Paul Bennewitz. In 1988, having collapsed under the weight of the government's deliberate psychological assault against him, Bennewitz, the once highly respected electronics expert and well-liked businessman, was admitted into a psychiatric hospital.
So many people knew ultimately about Paul Bennewitz and that sad, strange, horrible story that it got way out of the realm of just a cute flying saucer story.
I think it goes without saying that this case is a terrible reflection of government corruption and the abuse of power. I mean, I think that much is pretty obvious. But it's also a case that raises some disturbing questions about the government's role in shaping the UFO narrative. And as far as that question of whether or not our government would be willing to stage a fake alien invasion for strategic purposes, I guess that this Paul Bennewitz tragedy proves that they would, and in fact have, already done just that. And of course, Bennewitz is just one account on the public record. I mean, who knows how many times this type of thing might have happened. And if they were willing to go to such great lengths just to deceive one man, what might that suggest about what they're telling the rest of us? This is William Moore, a prominent figure in the UFO research community during the late 1970s and 1980s, who was best known for co-authoring the Roswell incident, which is probably one of the most influential ufology books ever published, and which really popularized the idea of a major government cover-up surrounding this phenomenon. And Moore was well respected by his peers, and he was praised for his ability to gather information from the corridors of military intelligence, considered by many to be an authority on topics like government secrecy and disinformation. He earned a reputation for being able to connect with key figures in the government, building relationships with government insiders who were willing to leak concealed information to him under the guise of aliases and code names like Condor and Falcon, but more on that later. But anyways, he was a key figure behind the popularization of the controversial Majestic 12 documents, among other famous alien-related headlines. He made a lot of media appearances, and he was a frequent speaker at UFO conventions. But meanwhile, some ufologists were beginning to question if his ties to the intelligence community had ventured too far. And so after achieving great success with his groundbreaking book, The Roswell Incident, William Moore had become one of the most prominent names in ufology, advancing his reputation and creating opportunities to delve even deeper into the shady world of military intelligence and government secrecy. And eventually he was contacted by a special agent within the Air Force who claimed to have inside information on UFOs and classified military operations. A special agent by the familiar name of Richard Doty.
Probably Doty's first success in rounding up a useful asset, as they say in the intelligence field, or a useful idiot, as they also say in the intelligence field, was his recruitment of a man named William Moore. Now, William Moore, I think very significantly, was the co-author of the first book about Roswell.
I was given the task of making contact with Bill Moore and basically finding out what he knew and who he knew. Bill was a little reluctant to disclose everything to me. For obvious reasons, here I am, a government agent, coming in and introducing myself and wanting to know what he knew. But there's techniques that we use, that we're trained to use in gaining that person's confidence. And I used those techniques against Bill Moore, and they worked, and Bill Moore took me into his confidence. And we had a professional relationship as far as him providing us information about the UFO community and agreeing to say things that we wanted said regarding the UFO community or within the UFO community.
Now, at first, Moore saw Doty as a valuable contact, somebody who could provide him with access to valuable information and further his research. I mean, after all, this is exactly how Doty presented himself, as a man with a mutual interest in the topic who happens to possess archives of confidential evidence that prove the existence of aliens. And so I'm sure that Doty probably utilized the same approach and the same sales pitch that he used against Paul Bennewitz and likely others, assuring Bill that he was on the right track and offering him help in his quest for the truth. And once again, another well-intentioned researcher's life would quickly spiral into a web of deceit. Doty and his colleagues would get back up to their own tricks, and they started providing him with false information, and they were presenting it as top secret knowledge. And William Moore, eager for this insider access, unwittingly became a tool in their disinformation campaign. And to make matters worse, Bill Moore was a public figure with a lot of influence in the burgeoning field of ufology. And so as a result, he would go on to inadvertently disseminate many of these lies and disinformation that he was being fed throughout the UFO community at large. By the time that Agent Doty met William Moore, he was already engaged in his psyop against Paul Bennewitz. And it wouldn't take very long before he would try to get Moore involved in the ordeal. Which is pretty crazy when you think about it, because here you have this prominent ufologist and self-described expert on the topic of a grand government cover-up, and you'd think that he would know better than to confide in a government secret agent, especially after being made aware of what was being done to Bennewitz. But Richard Doty is a professional liar, and somehow he managed to convince Bill Moore to join in his efforts, and in a selfish betrayal to a fellow UFO researcher and enthusiast, Bill Moore found himself drawn into this inhumane scheme against Bennewitz. And believing that he was inching closer to the real answers, Moore unwittingly became another one of Doty's shady associates, guilty of disseminating fabricated documents and false narratives to Paul Bennewitz, knowing all the while that it was pure disinformation. But eventually the truth would catch up to him, and in 1989, William Moore confessed that he had cooperated with government officials to mislead Paul Bennewitz in exchange for this access to classified information.
It became apparent to me that my supplying information to the government through Doty on the activities of Paul Bennewitz, APRO, and to a lesser extent several other individuals, was to be a part of this equation. I also discovered that whatever it was that Bennewitz was involved with, he was the subject of considerable interest on the part of not one, but several government agencies, and that they were actively trying to defuse him by pumping as much disinformation through him as he could possibly absorb. Being a very small part of that process gave me, I thought, something of an advantage. It became my intention to play that advantage for all the information I could get out of it. defense for his part.
Frankly, I'm a little ashamed of some people in this audience, regardless of what you believe, what you hear, or not.
They had to stop the talk about 4 or 5 times just because of all the yelling. People got mad, ran out of there. I saw a woman start crying and leave. People kept saying, "Where'd you get that crap from, Bill?" And one guy said, "I'm going to get a fire hose," and ran out the back. Very dramatic.
And this revelation really shocked the UFO community, who felt betrayed by Moore's complicity in this manipulation and mistreatment of a fellow researcher, Bennewitz. And it was an admission that ultimately destroyed his reputation, and also an incredibly ironic end to Bill Moore's story. Because here you got this prominent researcher, once known for debunking disinformation, who had himself now become a disinformation agent. And what he had hoped would have been his ticket to uncovering these hidden truths about UFOs turned into a career-ending scandal. Now, I do not have time to relay the stories of each investigator who has been compromised by their relationship with Richard Doty, let alone all the other special agents out there doing the same thing, but I can assure you that they exist. But today, you don't have to attend a MUFON conference to learn about them, because now they're being platformed on the evening news and on television shows, and they're doing podcast tours, and they're addressing Congress, They aren't conspiring against Paul Bennewitz anymore. Now they're talking right to you and me. And we've entered this time where our government now affirms the reality of UAPs, and our media is suddenly bombarding us with headlines about alien sightings and encounters all the time. But why should we believe them? Why should we expect them to be any more honest with us than they were with Bennewitz or with William Moore? For me, I'm led back to the questions that I opened up with. Could it be that this entire ET narrative is merely just a construct of government propaganda? Because judging from stories like these, it would seem that when it comes to researching this phenomenon, we have little to no way of distinguishing between what is true and what is counterintelligence, unless we experience it firsthand. But then again, if they're willing to fool Paul Bennewitz with helicopters disguised as flying saucers flying over his house, well, then perhaps even our own firsthand encounters can't be trusted. And really, the point that I'm trying to make here is that you and I are just as susceptible to deception as the 2 men that I just reported on. And if you think about it, the truth is that this UFO narrative has never been hidden from us. It's been fed to us. You may recall from earlier that I brought up some characters who went by the code names Condor and Falcon, allegedly government agents who leaked top-secret information to William Moore. Well, it would later be revealed that Falcon and Condor were merely 2 agents within a larger group of insiders who used bird-related code names to protect their identities. Cringy names like Hawk and Seagull and Raven, and this group was known by ufologists as the Avary. A name that's as corny as it is clever, and its members included influential figures from various government agencies, and each with access to classified information on UFOs and related phenomena. So this was kind of like a supergroup of government insiders, that were working together to leak this top secret UFO-related material. And this Falcon guy was perhaps the most influential member of the so-called Avary. And I gotta mention that today, most researchers have come to an almost unanimous conclusion that Falcon was actually none other than Richard Doty himself. And at the time, he did pretty well to stay under the radar. But with the advantage of hindsight, we can see that Falcon was actually making a lot of moves behind the scenes of the UFO research community back in the 1980s and 90s, allegedly leaking information about this alien cover-up to several influential ufologists, information that often turned out to be bogus. And so if this identification is accurate, and there's substantial evidence to suggest that it is, then it proves that Doty's government-sponsored deception campaigns were not isolated incidents involving only Paul Bennewitz or Bill Moore or ufologists. Instead, they were part of a larger agenda targeting the rest of the public, including people like you and me. In fact, in 1988, Falcon would be invited to join an impressive panel of UFO investigators on a widely viewed television special called UFO Cover-Up Live. And under the guise of an anonymous insider, he was able to disseminate his alien disinformation spiel once again, this time to millions of viewers across the world.
Stay with us. Bill Moore and Jamie Chandere introduce us to their government informants, codenamed Falcon and Condor. To protect their identities, they were photographed in shadow with their voices disguised. Stay with UFO Cover-Up Live and find out why Project Blue Book was classified top secret when we come back after this.
My understanding is that 3 different aliens of the same species have resided within the United States from 1948 or 49 until present day. The first alien was captured in the New Mexican desert after its craft crashed. The alien, which was named Eva by the government, was kept in captivity for 3 years. We learned a great deal of information about the aliens' race, culture, and spacecrafts. The second alien was a part of an exchange program. I don't recall what year that alien visited. The third alien was also part of an exchange program and has been a guest of the United States government since 1982.
So I hope that these stories have added a little bit more context to that thesis that I laid out at the beginning of this video. Is it true that this alien phenomenon is really being covered up by the government? Or could it be that it's actually the government who has perpetuated this myth from the beginning? I mean, think about it. Before the famous Kenneth Arnold sighting of 1947, the term flying saucer didn't even exist. In fact, Arnold himself struggled to describe what he saw, comparing the objects to saucers skipping on water. It was the media that took hold of that description and ran with the term flying saucer, which soon became synonymous with this concept of UFOs. And this was the event that is credited for kickstarting the modern UFO era. His story sent shockwaves across the country, but not by word of mouth, and not because there was any evidence to substantiate his claims, but because the press jumped on the story and flooded the public with sensational headlines about alien visitors and UFOs. And then, only 2 weeks later, the nation would shift its focus to New Mexico when news broke about another flying saucer, this time crashing into the ground in a remote ranch in Roswell. And when I say news broke, I'm not exaggerating. The Roswell Daily Record ran with the front page headline, RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. And this incident would become the foundation and bedrock of the entire alien cover-up conspiracy. Because, according to legend, the crashed flying saucer in Roswell and its pilots were allegedly retrieved by the military and then never seen again. You know, and famously, according to the official story, we were told that it was all only a weather balloon. And although not everybody was satisfied by that answer, you know, and a lot of people were still suspicious about the event, it really wasn't until the 1970s and 80s that this full-fledged conspiracy about an ongoing government cover-up regarding aliens and UFOs started to really gain traction, when researchers like Stanton Friedman and others began to revisit the Roswell incident. And, as I mentioned earlier, perhaps the most well-known and influential work that popularized this concept of an alien cover-up was the best-selling book, The Roswell Incident. And in light of this revelation that William Moore was involved in the psychological operation against Paul Bennewitz, well, then his book sort of takes on a different tone. I mean, you know, it's sort of telling when the very book that's often credited for popularizing this alien cover-up narrative was itself authored by a self-admitted disinformation agent, you know? But forget about Roswell and forget about the cover-up, because those were the old days, you know, those were the Project Blue Book days, back when the government's official position on UFOs was that they were either weather balloons or swamp gas, you know, and never anything else. And that narrative held for a long time, but it appears that this era of denial is over now. You know, and we seem to be approaching a situation that looks less like Project Blue Book and more like Project Blue Beam.
Project Blue Beam is trending. Man.
He started writing on a theme regarding a new world order. He said that he received documents pertaining to NASA. And in 1994, he published what was called Project Blue Beam, NASA, in which he detailed his claim that NASA, with the help of the United Nations, was attempting to implement a new age religion with the Antichrist as its head and start a new world order. Now that sounds really far-fetched today. Imagine how far-fetched it sounded in 1994.
You know, it's amazing to me that the term Project Bluebeam has actually been trending online lately. Because Project Bluebeam is one of those topics that everybody seems to reference, but few really seem to know much about. And for years, I really didn't know much about it either. You know, just that it had something to do with a secret plan to stage a fake alien invasion using holograms or something like that. But it was sort of a difficult topic to research back then, because most all the information that you could find about it was only in French, you know, aside from a few low-budget conspiracy websites and message boards that were filled with people who didn't seem any better informed about it than I was. Well, since then, I've done my homework on it, and here's the thing. Despite what you might have heard, Project Bluebeam is not an officially recognized program of NASA or the United Nations, as many sources tend to imply, nor is it based on a leaked government document, as many others have claimed. And I just want to set the record straight, because even without all those false claims, Project Bluebeam is still an incredible prediction, and one that's looking more plausible with each passing day. So here's what it's really about. In the mid-1990s, there was an investigative journalist from Canada who began to raise alarms about a terrible agenda that's so shocking, it seemed like something pulled from the script of an apocalyptic horror movie. And yet, outlandish as it was, for many people who read the original report, it carried a strange ring of truth. It all started with a simple article titled Project Bluebeam, and I guess subtitled NASA. And it was written by a man named Serge Monast. And in this article, Monast claimed to have uncovered a dark, global plan that's so audacious it just defied belief. According to his alleged sources, governments and powerful elites were preparing to stage nothing less than a full-scale simulated alien invasion. He claimed that this would be accomplished through a joint effort that was carried out by the United Nations and by America's NASA program. And he explained that by using advanced holographic technology, these elites would soon project images of UFOs and alien spaceships all over the skies, and tricking the entire world into believing that we were under attack from another species. He claimed that this fake alien invasion would be the final step in a master plan to bring the world under one centralized authority, a new order that would erase national borders, dissolve religious institutions, and break down the foundations of society as we know it. And that through fear and chaos, people would begin to abandon their faiths and their freedoms and accept a single, unified government as their only hope. And in the wake of this deception, a new religion would rise, designed to control the masses. Sounds pretty familiar, huh? And according to the original report, Project Bluebeam involves 4 stages that are designed to shift global consciousness to this new world system. The first stage aims to undermine all religious belief systems by orchestrating what Monast calls a reevaluation of archaeological knowledge. He says that the conspirators would accomplish this by triggering artificial earthquakes at key sites. Again, this is in the mid-90s, so artificial earthquakes is also pretty interesting when you look at today's headlines. But anyways, he says that by triggering these artificial earthquakes at key locations, it would uncover pre-planted artifacts that would be falsely presented as ancient discoveries. And something about these discoveries, or so-called ancient artifacts, will serve to debunk all existing religions. And it'll be used to rewrite history and to discredit established doctrines, convincing people that their faith has been misinterpreted for centuries. And it kind of reminds me of the growing popularity of shows like Ancient Aliens, where we've seen many archaeologists and scientists suggest that certain ancient structures may have been built by aliens. So just imagine if an earthquake were to reveal an artifact that defied our understanding of human history, perhaps something even alien in origin. And that doesn't even account for the fact that we've practically been bombarded by this alien invasion storyline for well over a century at this point. Just repeatedly influenced through books and movies and TV shows. And now this alien myth has embedded itself into our collective imagination as a society. And it's changed the way that we perceive the universe and our place in it. So it's really not a big surprise that Hollywood is also purported to play a significant role in the first stage of Project Bluebeam. Monast claims that films like 2001: A Space Odyssey and Star Trek and even Jurassic Park and others were created to subtly advance this strategy of manipulation by constantly pushing themes of space exploration and evolution, and ultimately serving to undermine society's belief in a creator and to gradually condition us to accept, or maybe to even anticipate, an impending alien invasion. But things get even worse in stage 2, which Manast refers to as the big space show in the sky. And this phase initiates a worldwide hoax orchestrated through advanced three-dimensional optical holograms and sophisticated sound technology. And by using laser projections, these stunning holographic images apparently will be displayed in the skies all over the world, and turning the heavens into a giant 3D movie screen. And these massive holographic scenes will play out in the skies above different regions, each tailored to reflect the dominant religious or cultural beliefs of that area. So for instance, in the United States, an image of Jesus Christ might appear, while in Indonesia, people would probably witness a portrayal of Allah or Muhammad or whatever. And accompanying these visual spectacles, a voice that is to be interpreted as the voice of God will start speaking to everybody, just speaking into the minds of everybody in the world, in every language, but delivering the same message to all of humanity. And Manast claims that this effect will be so realistic that it would truly appear to people as if divine figures are actually descending from the heavens. And he warned that the sheer scale and the precision of these staged events could convince much of the world that their spiritual hopes are finally being realized, while deceptively only drawing them deeper into this new universal religion. Serge Manast claimed that this technology was already being used at the time that he penned his report in 1994, and he suggested that UFO sightings and reports of flying saucers are often misinterpreted tests of this system, this holographic Bluebeam system, and that throughout the first 2 stages of Project Bluebeam, enough elements would have been presented to make this final spectacle believable and entrapping even the most skeptical minds. It kind of reminds me of that verse in Matthew 24.
For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect.
If it's real, this agenda seems to be specifically tailored to biblical end-time prophecies. And things only get weirder from here. Stage 3 introduces something called telepathic electronic two-way communication, according again to Manast. And it's another top-secret technology that he alleges is being developed by NASA. And this one involves the transmission of advanced low-frequency radio waves that are beamed directly into the minds of targeted individuals. And I use the term targeted individuals to reference the growing community of people who claim to be victims of this very thing. They call it electronic harassment. And believe it or not, there have been thousands of so-called targeted individual cases published involving people that really believe that they're being attacked with direct energy weapons or some other forms of electromagnetic or microwave technology. But essentially, that they are victims of electronic harassment, that something is beaming messages into their minds. And much like Project Bluebeam, many of them claim to experience these constant, inaudible voices. Today, this is often referred to as voice-to-skull technology, or V2K technology. And it's another example of something that exists today, despite seeming ridiculous when Manast's report was published back in the mid-90s. And just look that up online and you'll see what I mean. But in the case of Project Bluebeam, these signals would be crafted to imitate divine revelation or supernatural messages, leaving people to believe that they're actually hearing the voice of God, or angels, or even extraterrestrials. And the signal would be uniquely generated to appeal to their own personal belief system. This way, people would willingly accept this new religious system being established, regardless of their prior political or cultural or religious differences. And it's another concept that must have seemed ridiculous at the time it was first published, but it seems rather plausible in light of all these modern artificial intelligence advancements.
It's called a nanophotonic metasurface waveguide.
It's a fancy term to say there's a bunch of tiny optical elements embedded in the glass surface that help guide the light into and out of the waveguide.
Guiding light to create clear, moving images created using AI in 3D that can be projected on your eye. This is called an optical see-through augmented reality experience. It uses a small projector that sends the image through the waveguide where it bounces around before reaching your eye.
What we're thinking about is to provide a perceptually realistic experience that is very similar to the real world. And the vision is to go towards something that is indistinguishable from a real object.
And this brings us to the fourth and final stage, which is really just a matter of maximizing all these technologies and just turning the knobs up to 10. By this point, people are just wandering around in a state of confusion and vulnerability after enduring the first 3 steps of Project Bluebeam, and they're finally primed and susceptible to the final stage, the long-awaited alien invasion that will leave the whole world terrified, preying on the fears of extraterrestrial threats that have been steadily cultivated through decades of science fiction and UFO speculation. And while the unsuspecting citizens of the world finally succumb to the final stage of this alien propaganda, they'll be none the wiser that the whole thing was just a big hoax from the start. And it was only designed to set the stage for the establishment of this new system. And you got to remember that this article was published back in 1994. And you can just imagine how it was received back then. I mean, I admit that most of these claims seem incredibly unrealistic. But what happens when we start incorporating things like deep learning computer programs and generative AI? I mean, I'm sure in 1994, the idea of an artificially generated God seemed ridiculous. But even the free consumer version of ChatGPT could easily imitate a godlike message that's sensitive to your own personal data and preferences. And crazy holographic technology? Well, just look at the screen. If this is the commercial use of this stuff, then just imagine what the military might have. And I'm also sure that a lot of people chuckled back in the 90s about the idea of artificial thoughts being transmitted through radio signals and beamed into your mind. You know, that sounds like something out of a bad sci-fi movie. But then again, they didn't have Neuralink in 1994. And when you combine all this stuff together, you know, and you also throw in that we're hard at work on virtual reality systems for the metaverse, even Serge's most outrageous claims in stage 4 of Project Bluebeam, you know, regarding visualized manifestations of alien beings, may soon become a realistic possibility. And it makes you wonder what Monast would think about today's incredible leaps in technology, you know, many of which seem to echo the very things that he warned us about. But tragically, we'll never be able to hear his thoughts on this, because in 1996, just a year after publishing these controversial findings, Monast died of a sudden heart attack at only 51 years old, despite being in good health. His final year allegedly was consumed by this report, lecturing, writing, and pushing its message forward. And while some may dismiss his theories as outlandish, there were some unsettling circumstances surrounding his death that really leave room for pause. Things like strange police visits, government interference in his life, and most disturbingly, the Canadian government removed his children from his care, not due to any misconduct or any reported incident. Perhaps it was, as Monast claimed, to punish him for publishing this report. And I guess we'll never really know what happened. But if there was ever any merit to Project Bluebeam, I think that Monast's mysterious and untimely demise has only served to deepen the mystery surrounding his work.
Today's hearing featured a big new bombshell. Whistleblowers alleging there's a secret Pentagon program called Immaculate Constellation, containing files of evidence showing UFOs are real, and it's been withheld from Congress.
Excessive secrecy has led to grave misdeeds against loyal civil servants, military personnel, and the public, all to hide the fact that we are not alone in the cosmos.
2 years ago, when I published part 1 of this series, I predicted that governments were on the verge of launching this long-anticipated alien disclosure campaign. And now, if you've tuned into any media recently, you can see that it's here. I mean, it's unfolding right before our eyes.
Are you ever worried about little green men invading your backyard? Well, Congress apparently is, and it's holding hearings on what the government knows about UFOs.
And I'm not trying to brag or say, I told you so. It's pretty obvious to anyone who's been paying attention to this current rollout of these long-established agendas that's going on right now. You know, especially those that were accelerated by the so-called pandemic.
This is the second congressional hearing looking at unidentified anomalous phenomena, or UAPs as they're known at the Pentagon. And lawmakers came out swinging, accusing the government of a vast conspiracy to cover up the truth about our interstellar neighbors.
And we've known for some time that in order to justify the final steps towards this global government, there would have to be a significant and world-altering event that takes place first, you know? Something impactful enough to compel people to embrace the establishment of such a system. And it would seem that this moment that we've been anticipating is now upon us.
A former Israeli space official says he has proof. He's claiming that there is a, quote, galactic federation stop it out.
He also explains that President Trump both knows about them and was on the verge of disclosing their existence, only to be persuaded not to by the Federation in order to avoid mass hysteria and panic here on Earth. Apparently, humanity just still has a long way to grow before we can understand the gravity of their presence.
So I hope that you're prepared to live in a world where aliens exist, because it's going to put a lot of weight on the back of the church, and it's going to challenge Christian theology in profound ways. And as this fabricated disclosure campaign continues to unravel, I think that many lukewarm Christians will try to compromise their faith in creation to make room for these unbiblical alien imposters. And then countless believers whose faith is already fragile will probably fall away. After all, if people start accepting this narrative that these entities are extraterrestrial visitors, then how will they reconcile their belief that Jesus Christ died only for the sins of mankind, you know? And how will they justify their belief in being created in the image of God when they're confronted by beings who are far more intelligent and far more advanced than any human? But it won't be the first time that the church has faced a crisis like this, because there was a time when creationism was actually widely accepted by the population, you know, long before the theory of evolution was so aggressively pushed onto society. And in fact, believe it or not, even biblical cosmology was once taught in American schools, you know, right alongside the Ten Commandments. And it wasn't all that long ago that we wouldn't have even questioned the idea that there were only two genders, right? But yet, look how quickly deception takes hold once it's endorsed by the so-called scientific consensus. And now, centuries of calculated propaganda have completely reshaped our understanding of reality. And so in this context, the concept of a manufactured or fake alien agenda begins to make a lot more sense, doesn't it? You know, not just the possibility of a staged invasion, but even our very belief in the secular model of outer space itself. Why is it that so many Christians accept the idea that we live in an ever-expanding universe that's filled with trillions of galaxies and trillions of Earth-like planets when this concept is in blatant contradiction to the biblical account of creation? I mean, we're really quick to reject the theory of evolution, and yet many of us turn around and accept a cosmological model of this universe that only makes sense within the framework of the Big Bang Theory. You know, yet what the Bible teaches leaves very little room for curiosity about other planets, much less other planets with life on them. And if you can look at this phenomenon through the lens of what the Bible teaches, this topic of extraterrestrials suddenly takes on a whole new meaning. Because while the scriptures don't explicitly discuss extraterrestrial life, they do describe the existence of demonic spiritual beings that aim to deceive humanity. And although the Bible doesn't mention things like alien abductions, we can sure trace a lot of similarities to what the Bible does teach about demonic oppression and demonic possession. You know, and even UFOs are not a strange concept from a biblical worldview. I mean, the Bible doesn't reference flying saucers, but it certainly includes plenty of strange sightings in the skies. You know, you got angels and fallen angels descending from the heavens and ascending into the heavens. You got bright guiding stars, radiant clouds of glory, chariots in the sky, of course Ezekiel's wheel, you know, and prophecies about signs in the sun and the moon and the stars in the end time, and the list goes on. So could it be that this UFO phenomenon is actually a disguise for something spiritual in nature? I can't think of a better disguise for a malicious army of demonic and satanic beings than visitors from another planet. And I know that this is all a lot to digest, but it's something that I think you should ponder. Because before you can make any sense out of what we're seeing in this world around us today, you need to first understand that Satan is the god of this world. You know, that's what the Bible says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. And I know that I quote that scripture a lot, but it's because I think it's something that many Christians don't take seriously enough. You know, we often think of Satan as he's described in 1 Peter chapter 5, as a roaring lion that's seeking out individuals whom he may devour. But in truth, Satan's agenda extends far beyond our own personal spiritual battles. You know, his influence encompasses all of humanity and even creation itself. He is the god of this age. He's the eye on the top of the pyramid. You know, he's the adversary of God and the deceiver of mankind. And he's been granted temporary authority over the systems of this fallen world. And so to me, it makes a lot of sense in context to the world that we see around us today. Because who else would seek to destroy the family unit and kill babies and mutilate our bodies and degrade our culture and poison the population and lead humanity into a web of deception and confusion other than Satan himself? himself, right? I mean, we know from scripture that Satan's ultimate goal is to lead the world into chaos and rebellion against God. But he knows that any authority he has is only temporary, and he knows that his power is limited and that his time is running out. And so if you think that our leaders would never engage in something so sinister or so deceptive as an alien invasion hoax, there's really no reason to question the motive or to ask why they would do it. You know, it's the same agenda as always: to contradict God's word, to reject God's authority, and to drive humanity further from God. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul warns us that Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. So for me, the idea that they might present themselves as aliens fits this description almost perfectly, you know, because that's a story that we've been conditioned to accept over generations. And when some of these end-time prophecies of Revelation unfold, the world will grasp at any explanation, no matter how far-fetched, to avoid acknowledging the biblical reality of what's actually happening.
We're past the point. Yes, aliens exist, whatever. We have reverse engineered their craft. We have these materials. We know this now. That's on the congressional record. We have this stuff. Like, let's move the conversation beyond that.
We will use NASA's expertise to work with other agencies to analyze UAP. We will use AI and machine learning to search the skies for anomalies, as we have been searching the heavens, and will continue to search the heavens for habitability. And NASA will do this transparently.
You know, after more than 2 years of relentless research and 4 full-length documentaries, I wish I could close out this series with some type of dramatic, groundbreaking evidence, you know, or some bombshell revelation to finally prove the definitive truth behind UFOs and the alien agenda. I mean, it'd be really cool if I could tell you that I have single-handedly solved this mystery once and for all, you know, and then roll the credits. But, of course, I have not. And I think the truth is that we were never meant to, because some mysteries belong to God alone. Some of God's plans are not intended for us to fully grasp or understand, but just to simply accept and to trust in Him through faith and not by sight. And anyone who has studied the book of Revelation could agree that biblical prophecies and visions about the end times are not necessarily the easiest literature to read or comprehend. And that's by design. You know, such scriptures are not intended to offer clear step-by-step predictions for the future, but to reveal deep and symbolic spiritual realities to those with eyes to see and with ears to hear. And I believe that we should approach this alien agenda topic with that same understanding. You know, not like a riddle that can be solved, but more like a test of spiritual discernment. I wasn't required to provide any grainy pictures of fallen angels or to debunk UFO videos or to reveal any top secret documents to make my case. I came equipped with nothing more than a genuine faith in God and a modest amount of common sense. And using only the wisdom that God has made available to us through His Word, it becomes pretty obvious that these so-called alien revelations are not what they claim to be. And I would hope that for all of my effort in creating this film series, you can now see that this alien phenomenon is nothing more than a worldly agenda that was constructed through decades of witchcraft, occult influences, and institutions like governments, militaries, academia, Hollywood, and the media, all working together to create and then perpetuate this modern alien narrative, pushing it beyond the confines of science fiction and into the real world around us, you know, only to turn around and then use that same narrative to distort reality and distract humanity from the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And if you can see that, then you should be able to easily identify that the culprit of this entire conspiracy is Satan himself, the adversary, the enemy of God. Because from the fall of man to the end of days, his mission has always been to undermine God's authority and to lead human souls astray. So if you ask me, this whole alien narrative is really just the latest chapter in the ancient battle of good and evil. You know, it's just another secular theory that's trying to explain something spiritual using worldly and material terms, and attempting to persuade the world to reject the Creator while embracing His creation. And I believe that as these end-time events begin to unfold before the eyes of men, you know, both in the heavens and on the earth, that many will be deceived. But as believers, we are not called to fear. We are called to stand firm, discerning truth from fiction and trusting in the promises of God. But whatever happens, whether this world observes the arrival of fallen angels disguised as aliens, or perhaps we experience a giant invasion hoax, like Project Bluebeam suggests. Or maybe I'm just completely wrong, and aliens really do exist, and we have some type of Independence Day style invasion. All I know for sure is that in the end, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And if there's one thing that I hope you take away from this film series, it would be an increased faith and deeper trust in God's sovereignty and the reliability of His word. Because if this alien disclosure campaign ever does transcend into an actual invasion, whether real or staged, the people of this fallen world will be suddenly looking for the truth. And sadly, most will turn around and seek answers from the very same institutions who had been orchestrating the agenda all along. But in that moment, those of us who do know the truth must be ready. And we must be prepared to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ to a world that will be yearning for answers more than ever before. And sharing the truth is actually really simple because we have the gospel, so the work is already done. Salvation has come to the world through Jesus Christ. And you don't need to be a scholar or a theologian to share that truth because we have the Bible, because we have the Word of God. And it's accessible to the world, and everything that this world needs to know is right there. And it will guide us through this age of darkness like a lamp to our feet. And in the midst of all the chaos and confusion surrounding us in these end times, we can find great peace and comfort in knowing that everything we experience down here is all part of God's divine plan. And it's a plan that traces all the way back to the very first verse of the Bible, when in the beginning,
For I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord.